April 11, 1998, began like any other quiet day in Riverdale, Tennessee. The air was crisp with the first hints of spring, and the small town bustled with its usual rhythm. By mid-afternoon, though, the tranquility shattered. A frantic call to the police reported a gruesome discovery near the Morgan estate, nestled at the edge of the dense woods. The body of Sabrina Morgan, beloved mother, acclaimed ballerina, and the epitome of grace in Riverdale, had been found lifeless in the shadows of the towering trees. News of the tragedy swept through the town like wildfire, leaving the close-knit community in stunned disbelief. Sabrina wasn't just anyone, she was a local icon, celebrated for her radiant presence both on and off the stage. Her performances at the Riverdale Ballet Theatre had drawn audiences from miles away, and her charity work painted her as a beacon of kindness and perfection. How could such a brutal end befall someone so seemingly untouchable? The scene itself was haunting. Yellow police tape cordoned off the area where Sabrina's body lay, partially obscured by underbrush. Detectives combed the site, their grim expressions revealing the weight of the situation. Bloodstains on the forest floor hinted at a violent confrontation, but the investigators kept their findings close. This wasn't just a death, it was a murder. At the Morgan estate, mere miles from where Sabrina's body had been discovered, a different kind of turmoil unfolded. Richard Morgan, Sabrina's husband, was a man known for his commanding presence and his empire in real estate. His steely exterior now betrayed cracks, his hands trembling as he answered questions from the police. His two children, Emma, 10, and Liam, 8, clung to their grandmother, their innocent faces pale with confusion. The whispers in Riverdale grew louder by the hour. What had happened in the forest that night? Why was Sabrina alone in such a secluded area? And perhaps most unsettling of all, was her death connected to the text message she had sent just minutes before her phone went silent? Investigators had uncovered a short, cryptic note on Sabrina's phone, sent to an unknown number: "I can't do this anymore. Meet me where it began." The cryptic message left more questions than answers, and speculation ran rampant. Some suggested a secret lover, while others pointed fingers at Richard, questioning the stability of their seemingly perfect marriage. As reporters descended upon Riverdale, the town found itself under a harsh spotlight, its secrets on the verge of unraveling. But one thing was clear: Sabrina's life wasn't as idyllic as it had appeared. Behind the polished facade was a woman grappling with pressures and choices that would ultimately lead to her demise. As the community mourned, the police began to piece together the fragmented clues, uncovering a story darker and more twisted than anyone could have imagined. This was only the beginning. The truth lay buried in Sabrina's final days, hidden within the relationships and secrets she fought desperately to protect. The question wasn't just who killed Sabrina Morgan, it was why. Riverdale, Tennessee, was the kind of town where everyone knew each other, or at least thought they did. With its tree-lined streets, charming storefronts, and a church steeple that pierced the sky at its center, it seemed a place untouched by the chaos of the world. The Morgan family had long stood as a symbol of success and sophistication in this idyllic community, their lives seemingly pulled straight from the pages of a lifestyle magazine. At the heart of this family was Sabrina Morgan, a woman whose beauty and poise were the envy of many. At 35, Sabrina was not only a mother to 2 young children but also an acclaimed ballerina who had graced stages across the state. Her every movement carried an effortless elegance, whether she was performing under the spotlight or walking through the bustling farmers' market in downtown Riverdale. Yet, beyond her polished exterior, Sabrina carried a quiet weight, one that no one, not even her closest friends, could quite see. Sabrina had met her husband, Richard Morgan, nearly 15 years earlier, when they were both young and ambitious. Richard, now 45, had built a formidable career in real estate, transforming acres of farmland into luxury properties that catered to the state's elite. His towering 6 feet 3 inches frame and sharp, commanding demeanor made him a natural leader, someone who could close a deal with just a handshake. But success came at a cost. Richard's relentless drive often left him absent, both physically and emotionally, from the family he claimed to cherish. The Morgan estate, located on the outskirts of Riverdale, was a sprawling testament to Richard's achievements. The mansion stood proud atop a hill, surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens and a dense forest that stretched for miles. To outsiders, it was a dream home, the epitome of wealth and stability. But for Sabrina, it often felt like a gilded cage. The long corridors echoed with loneliness during Richard's frequent business trips, and the pressures of maintaining a picture-perfect life weighed heavily on her. Then there were their children, Emma, a precocious 10-year-old with her mother's grace, and Liam, a spirited 8-year-old who idolized his father. To Sabrina, they were her anchor, the reason she kept up the facade of the perfect wife and mother. Every morning, she prepared their lunches, drove them to school, and attended their events, her radiant smile masking the growing cracks in her own happiness. The community adored Sabrina, though they saw her more as a figure than a person. To the members of Riverdale Ballet Theatre, she was a star. To the mothers at her children's school, she was an aspirational figure who balanced motherhood and artistry with ease. But no one saw the nights when Sabrina sat alone in her expansive bedroom, staring out at the dark forest that bordered their property, wondering if this was all her life would ever be. And then there was Father Samuel McGregor, a man whose quiet strength had made him a fixture in the community for nearly 2 decades. As the parish priest at Holy Grace Church, he was a source of comfort and wisdom to Riverdale's residents. Samuel's sermons were deeply personal, and his ability to listen without judgment made him a confidant to many. He had a way of making people feel seen, valued, qualities that Sabrina found herself drawn to as the distance between her and Richard grew. But there was more to Father Samuel than met the eye. Before arriving in Riverdale, he had served in another parish under a different name, escaping a past shrouded in scandal. Whispers of misconduct and a mysterious death followed him, though the church had worked tirelessly to bury the truth. To Sabrina, however, he was simply a kind soul who understood her struggles in a way no one else did. Despite their seemingly perfect lives, the Morgans were a family on the brink. Richard's increasing detachment, Sabrina's growing sense of isolation, and the presence of a priest with secrets of his own created a volatile mix. The stage was set for tragedy, though no one could yet see the storm brewing just beneath the surface. Riverdale adored the Morgan family, but adoration was built on illusion. Behind closed doors, the carefully curated facade was cracking. Sabrina's inner turmoil, Richard's blind ambition, and Samuel's hidden darkness would soon collide, unraveling the perfect image and revealing a tale of betrayal, passion, and consequence. In Riverdale, Father Samuel McGregor was a man of reverence and quiet charisma. For over 15 years, he had served as the parish priest at Holy Grace Church, a historic stone building that stood at the heart of the community. To the people of Riverdale, Father Samuel was more than just a clergyman. He was a shepherd, a confidant, and a source of solace for the town's troubled souls. His sermons were eloquent and moving, delivered with a calm authority that left his congregation hanging on every word. It was easy to see why he was so beloved. He seemed untouchable, an anchor of morality in an uncertain world. Yet, there was an unsettling depth to Samuel's eyes, a faint shadow that lingered despite his warm smile. Most would dismiss it as the burden of his role, the weight of so many people's problems on his shoulders. But the truth was far darker. Before he arrived in Riverdale, Samuel McGregor was a different man. He had another name, another life, and another parish in a distant state. Back then, he was at the center of a scandal that the church had worked diligently to suppress. A young woman, bright, devout, and full of potential, had died under suspicious circumstances. Her body was found in her small apartment, and while the cause of death was ruled as accidental, rumors spread like wildfire. Whispers of her involvement with a priest began to circulate, with Samuel's name spoken in hushed tones. The church moved quickly to contain the situation. Witnesses were silenced, records altered, and Samuel was transferred to Riverdale with a new identity. To ensure his transition, the church provided glowing references and financial backing for Holy Grace Church, making him an indispensable asset to the town. In Riverdale, no one questioned his past. To them, Father Samuel was a gift from God, a man of wisdom and kindness who had come to guide their community. But the past rarely stays buried. For Samuel, the shadows of his former life lingered in his mind like an unshakable specter. He convinced himself he had been given a second chance, that the mistakes of his past could be left behind. And for years, it seemed he had succeeded. Riverdale embraced him wholeheartedly. He became a regular presence at family gatherings, a trusted advisor to the town's influential figures, and a man who could always be relied upon to listen without judgment. It was in this role that he first grew close to the Morgan family. Richard Morgan, a lifelong member of Holy Grace, respected Samuel as both a spiritual guide and a friend. Samuel had officiated the baptisms of both Emma and Liam, attended charity events hosted by Sabrina, and shared countless meals at the Morgan estate. To Richard, Samuel was an ally, a man who embodied the virtues he sought to instill in his own family. Sabrina, however, saw Samuel differently. Where Richard saw a mentor, Sabrina found someone who genuinely seemed to understand her. Over time, their conversations deepened. During confession, she shared her doubts about her marriage, her struggles to balance motherhood and career, and her growing sense of isolation. Samuel listened with an intensity that made her feel truly heard for the first time in years. But Samuel's attentiveness was not born solely of compassion. As Sabrina opened up to him, something inside him stirred, something he had tried to suppress since his past scandal. Her vulnerability was intoxicating, her beauty undeniable, and her pain mirrored his own unspoken regrets. He began to rationalize their growing closeness, convincing himself that he was helping her, guiding her through her struggles. In truth, he was crossing boundaries he had no right to approach. The more Sabrina confided in him, the more Samuel's facade began to crack. He became protective of her, defensive when others questioned her choices. At first, it seemed harmless, a priest offering support to a member of his flock. But Samuel's actions hinted at something deeper, more personal. He began to insert himself subtly into her life, offering advice that drew her closer to him and further from Richard. As Samuel and Sabrina's connection deepened, the ghosts of his past began to resurface. The same impulses that had led to his downfall years ago now threatened to undo him again. But this time, the stakes were higher. Riverdale had given him a fresh start, a community that adored him. To risk it all for Sabrina was unthinkable, yet he found himself unable to stay away. Father Samuel McGregor had come to Riverdale seeking redemption, but the choices he was making with Sabrina were leading him down a familiar, dangerous path. The shadow of his past loomed over him, and though no one in the town suspected it, the man they trusted so deeply was on the brink of repeating history. It began innocently, as most dangerous things do. For Sabrina Morgan, Father Samuel McGregor was a source of comfort in her increasingly strained life. Richard's absences had become more frequent, and even when he was home, his focus remained on work. Their once passionate marriage had turned into a transactional relationship, defined by duty rather than affection. The children, while her greatest joy, could not fill the void of loneliness that seemed to grow within her. Samuel had become a fixture in Sabrina's life. Their conversations after Sunday Mass turned longer, their tone more intimate. He always seemed to know the right words, the perfect scripture, to ease her burdens. In him, she found a listening ear, a gentle reassurance that she was not invisible. What began as casual chats about life's challenges soon evolved into deeper, more personal discussions. Sabrina started seeking him out more often, after rehearsals, between errands, or during the quiet afternoons when the house felt too large and too empty. For Samuel, her vulnerability was irresistible. At first, he told himself that he was simply doing his duty as a priest, offering guidance to a parishioner in need. But as Sabrina's trust in him deepened, so did his feelings for her. He began to notice the way her eyes lingered when they spoke, the subtle brush of her hand when they said goodbye. It wasn't long before he found himself thinking of her during the stillness of the night, her face invading his prayers. The first time they crossed the line, it was an accident, or so they both told themselves. Sabrina had arrived at the church late one evening, visibly shaken after an argument with Richard. Samuel, ever the empathetic listener, invited her into his office. The dimly lit room became a cocoon, shielding them from the world outside. Sabrina poured her heart out, her voice trembling as she admitted to feeling unloved, unseen, trapped. Samuel moved to comfort her, placing a hand on her shoulder. But when she looked up at him, her tear-streaked face inches from his, something unspoken passed between them. He hesitated, his rational mind screaming at him to stop, but the pull was too strong. Their lips met in a kiss that was both tentative and electrifying, a moment that shattered the fragile boundaries they had kept intact. The guilt was immediate and overwhelming. Sabrina left in a rush, her heart pounding with a mix of exhilaration and shame. Samuel spent the night pacing the cold floors of the church, torn between his vows and the emotions he could no longer deny. They both vowed it wouldn't happen again, but the thrill of the forbidden had awakened something in them that neither could suppress. Their meetings became more frequent, more calculated. They exchanged letters hidden in hymnals, shared lingering glances during services, and found excuses to be alone. Sabrina started inventing lies to explain her absences to Richard, late-night rehearsals, emergency meetings with the ballet company. Samuel, too, became reckless, arranging secret rendezvous in secluded spots around Riverdale. What Sabrina saw as a refuge from her unhappy marriage, Samuel saw as a second chance at the connection he had long denied himself. But as their affair deepened, so did its complications. Samuel became possessive, demanding more of her time and attention. He began to resent Richard, viewing him as an unworthy husband who had failed to cherish Sabrina. His once gentle demeanor shifted, his messages to her grew more insistent, his temper more volatile when she hesitated to meet him. Sabrina, meanwhile, found herself trapped in a web of lies she could barely manage. The more she tried to maintain the illusion of her perfect life, the more her guilt gnawed at her. Yet, the illicit nature of their relationship was intoxicating. Every stolen moment, every whispered confession, felt like a rebellion against the constraints of her life. But their passion came at a cost. Samuel began pushing boundaries, asking her to make impossible choices. He wanted her to leave Richard, to start a new life with him, something Sabrina couldn't imagine doing without destroying her children's lives. She tried to pull back, to set limits, but Samuel's grip on her tightened. Their affair, once a secret sanctuary, had become a powder keg. Samuel's increasingly erratic behavior and Sabrina's mounting guilt made their connection both unsustainable and dangerous. They were two people spiraling out of control, unaware that the choices they were making would soon set off a chain of events with devastating consequences. Richard Morgan was a man who prided himself on control. In his business dealings, he was always a step ahead, always the one calling the shots. But at home, cracks in the foundation of his seemingly perfect life had begun to show. Sabrina's absences were becoming more frequent, her explanations increasingly vague. Late-night rehearsals, sudden meetings, and overnight stays with friends, all excuses that sounded reasonable on the surface but felt hollow upon closer inspection. At first, Richard dismissed his suspicions. He had built an empire on trust and precision, and the idea that his wife, his Sabrina, could be hiding something from him felt unfathomable. But as the weeks turned into months, her behavior became harder to ignore. She was distant, distracted, often caught staring out the window with a faraway look in her eyes. Even the children noticed, asking why their mother was always so tired, so busy. The breaking point came one evening when Richard returned home earlier than expected from a business trip. Sabrina was nowhere to be found. Her phone, left carelessly on the kitchen counter, buzzed with a notification. Richard hesitated but picked it up, his curiosity outweighing his respect for privacy. The message was from an unknown number, reading simply, "Same time tomorrow." I need to see you. Something snapped within him. Richard wasn't a man prone to impulsive decisions, but this was different. The cold, creeping realization that his wife might be involved in something, or someone, beyond their marriage drove him to act. He hired a private investigator the very next day, a discreet professional who specialized in uncovering infidelities. The instructions were clear: follow Sabrina, document her activities, and report back with the truth, no matter how painful. The investigator didn't take long to deliver results. Sabrina's movements were methodical but not entirely inconspicuous. On her rehearsal nights, she wasn't at the ballet studio. Instead, she was seen meeting Father Samuel McGregor in secluded places, first at coffee shops, then at the church after hours, and eventually at a remote hotel on the outskirts of Riverdale. The evidence was damning: photographs of the two entering and leaving the hotel, their faces lit with an intimacy that left no room for misinterpretation. Richard stared at the photos for hours, his hands trembling as he tried to make sense of it all. The betrayal was more than he could bear. Sabrina, the woman he had built his life with, had deceived him. And worse, she had done so with a man he trusted, Samuel, the family priest, the friend who had been a part of their lives for years. The anger that surged within him was cold and calculated, not the fiery rage of a man consumed by emotion but the quiet determination of someone who refused to be made a fool. Confronting Sabrina immediately would accomplish nothing. She would deny it, twist the narrative, and leave him without the upper hand. Richard needed a plan. He needed to catch them in the act, to force them to face the truth in a way they couldn't escape. In the days that followed, Richard played the part of the unsuspecting husband. He kissed Sabrina goodbye as she left for her so-called rehearsals, even offering to drive her once, only to be met with a hurried refusal. Inside, though, his anger festered, growing darker with each passing day. The opportunity came sooner than he had anticipated. The investigator informed him of Sabrina's next meeting with Samuel, scheduled for a Saturday night at the same remote hotel. This time, Richard wouldn't just wait for the investigator's report, he would be there himself. He rehearsed every scenario in his mind, envisioning how the confrontation would unfold. His anger sharpened his focus, leaving no room for doubt or hesitation. On the night of the meeting, Richard followed the investigator's car at a safe distance, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. When Sabrina pulled into the hotel parking lot, Richard parked discreetly nearby, watching as she disappeared into the lobby. He waited, his pulse pounding in his ears, until the investigator confirmed the room number. Richard stepped out of his car, his breath steady but shallow. In his hand was a golf club he had taken from the trunk, its weight comforting in his grip. He moved through the hotel with purpose, each step bringing him closer to the confrontation he both dreaded and craved. The door to the room was slightly ajar, and as Richard approached, he could hear muffled voices inside. Sabrina's laughter, once a sound he cherished, now felt like a dagger to his chest. Without hesitation, he pushed the door open, the force slamming it against the wall. The sight that greeted him, Sabrina and Samuel, locked in an intimate embrace, confirmed every suspicion, every fear he had tried to suppress. Their wide-eyed expressions of shock were etched into his mind, but Richard wasn't looking for explanations. He had all the answers he needed. In that moment, the carefully constructed image of the Morgan family shattered. And in the wreckage, Richard's rage burned cold and unrelenting, setting the stage for a confrontation that would end in blood. The remote hotel on the outskirts of Riverdale was quiet that night, its dimly lit corridors and worn carpets offering an air of anonymity for its guests. Room 214, tucked away at the end of the second-floor hallway, seemed like the perfect place for secrets to unfold. Inside, Sabrina Morgan and Father Samuel McGregor had created a bubble of stolen moments, one that was about to burst in the most violent way imaginable. Sabrina sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped nervously in her lap. The thrill that once came with these encounters had begun to wane, replaced by an ever-growing weight of guilt. Samuel paced the room, his movements jittery and uncharacteristically restless. His usual calm demeanor was frayed, his obsession with Sabrina now teetering dangerously close to desperation. "You can't keep doing this, Sabrina," Samuel said, his voice low but tense. "Lying to Richard, sneaking around like this. It's not fair to any of us, especially not to me." Sabrina looked up at him, her eyes filled with conflict. "I don't know what you want me to say, Samuel. I can't just leave my family. My children." "You think I don't understand that," he interrupted, his tone sharp. "But you're miserable, Sabrina. With me, you can finally be happy. You belong with me, not with him." Before she could respond, a sudden noise from the hallway froze them both. The sharp click of footsteps grew louder, echoing ominously as they approached the door. Sabrina's heart pounded in her chest as she turned toward Samuel, her panic mirrored in his eyes. The door slammed open with a violent force, hitting the wall with a deafening crash. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted by the flickering hallway light, was Richard Morgan. In his hand, he held a golf club, its metal gleaming faintly under the dim light. His face was a mask of cold fury, his eyes dark and unrelenting. "Richard," Sabrina began, her voice trembling. "Don't," he snapped, cutting her off. His voice was low and steady, but it carried an edge sharp enough to cut through steel. He stepped into the room, letting the door swing shut behind him. The tension in the air was suffocating. Samuel instinctively moved to place himself between Sabrina and Richard, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Richard, listen, this isn't what it looks like. We can talk about this." Richard's laugh was hollow, devoid of humor. "Talk? You want to talk after what you've done? After what she's done?" His gaze flicked to Sabrina, his voice trembling with the weight of his betrayal. "How could you, Sabrina? How could you do this to me? To our family?" Sabrina stood, her voice breaking as she tried to explain. "Richard, please, But before she could finish, Richard raised the golf club with a speed that made both Sabrina and Samuel flinch. The first swing came without warning, connecting with Samuel's shoulder and sending him staggering back into the dresser. The priest cried out in pain, but Richard's rage was unrelenting. The second blow struck Samuel across the side of his head, the sickening crack echoing through the room. He crumpled to the floor, blood pooling beneath him as Sabrina screamed, her voice raw and desperate. "Stop! Richard, stop!" she pleaded, rushing toward him. He turned to her, his face a mask of anguish and fury. "You don't get to tell me to stop, Sabrina. Not after this." Before she could react, he swung the club again, this time aiming at her. The impact sent her sprawling to the floor, her vision blurring as pain radiated through her skull. The room spun around her, the sounds of her cries fading into a hollow silence. Richard stood over them, his chest heaving, the bloodied golf club trembling in his grip. The rage that had consumed him moments ago began to ebb, replaced by a cold, sinking realization. He dropped the club with a metallic clang, its handle stained with the evidence of his actions. The hotel manager, alerted by the commotion, had already called the police. When they arrived, they found Richard sitting on the floor between the two lifeless bodies, his hands stained red and his eyes vacant. He didn't resist as they handcuffed him, nor did he speak. The only words he uttered before being led away were soft, almost inaudible, "What have I done?" The crime scene was a nightmare. Blood spattered the walls and carpet, a stark contrast to the room's otherwise mundane decor. Investigators worked methodically, documenting every detail while officers escorted a dazed Richard to the waiting patrol car. The town of Riverdale, so small and so seemingly perfect, would never be the same. The Morgan family's secrets had exploded into violence, leaving behind a tragedy that would haunt the community for years to come. But even as the police pieced together the events of that fateful night, the deeper question remained: was Richard Morgan's outburst the act of a man pushed to his limits, or the culmination of choices no one was willing to face? The aftermath of the murders at the remote hotel rippled through Riverdale like a shockwave, shattering the town's tranquil image and leaving its residents grappling with disbelief. The once celebrated Morgan family was now at the center of a scandal so gruesome, so incomprehensible, that it became the subject of hushed conversations in every diner, church pew, and school parking lot. Richard Morgan, a man once revered for his success and composure, sat in a cold jail cell, staring at the walls as the weight of his actions pressed down on him. The bloodied golf club used in the murders had been bagged as evidence, and the haunting images of Sabrina and Father Samuel's lifeless bodies haunted him relentlessly. He said little during his initial interrogation, offering no justification, no excuse, only silence. His once commanding presence had diminished, leaving behind a hollow shell of a man consumed by regret and anger. The media descended on Riverdale with a voracious appetite for every lurid detail of the case. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, their cameras capturing every moment of the unfolding drama. Headlines blared with sensational phrases like, "Betrayal and Bloodshed," "The Morgan Scandal," and "Priest and Mistress Slain in Shocking Hotel Murder." News vans lined the streets, and the town, once a sleepy refuge from the chaos of the outside world, became a stage for national infamy. At the heart of the tragedy were Emma and Liam, the Morgan children. Shielded as much as possible by their grandparents, the two young ones struggled to understand what had happened. Their once happy home was gone, replaced by whispered conversations and stolen glances of pity. Emma, at 10, was old enough to sense the gravity of the situation, her innocent questions met with evasive answers. Liam, only 8, clung to the fragments of his old life, asking when his parents would come back home. Their world, once secure and filled with love, had been torn apart by forces they couldn't comprehend. The trial of Richard Morgan became a spectacle that captivated the nation. Prosecutors painted him as a cold-blooded killer, driven to commit unspeakable acts out of jealousy and rage. They presented graphic photos of the crime scene, paired with testimonies from police officers and the hotel manager who had heard the commotion. The prosecution's case was airtight. Richard had planned the confrontation, bringing a weapon and following Sabrina to the hotel with clear intent. But the defense team crafted a compelling counternarrative. They portrayed Richard as a broken man, pushed beyond the brink by betrayal and the psychological toll of a wife's infidelity. The defense delved into Father Samuel's past, unearthing a scandal long buried by the church. Evidence of the priest's manipulative behavior and predatory tendencies painted a picture of a man who had preyed on Sabrina's vulnerabilities, exploiting her unhappiness for his own gain. They argued that Richard's actions, while horrific, were not premeditated but the result of a momentary lapse, a crime of passion fueled by unimaginable emotional pain. As witnesses took the stand, the courtroom became a battleground of emotions. The private investigator recounted his findings, presenting photographs of Sabrina and Samuel's meetings. Experts testified about the psychological effects of infidelity, illustrating the devastating impact it can have on even the most composed individuals. Richard's legal team leaned heavily on these arguments, positioning him as a man who had been destroyed by the choices of those he trusted most. The jury deliberated for days, their decision hanging on a razor's edge. Riverdale residents held their breath, torn between sympathy for Richard and horror at the brutality of his actions. When the verdict was finally read, not guilty by reason of temporary insanity, the courtroom erupted. Some wept, others shouted in outrage. Richard sat motionless as the words washed over him, his expression unreadable. Despite his legal exoneration, Richard's life was irrevocably changed. The man who had once been a pillar of the community was now a pariah. He sold the Morgan estate, liquidated his assets, and retreated into isolation, leaving Riverdale behind. The town, meanwhile, struggled to move on. Holy Grace Church, now tainted by the revelations about Father Samuel, closed its doors for good. Its once pristine stone facade became a grim reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded within its congregation. For Sabrina, the legacy she had built as a talented ballerina and devoted mother was overshadowed by the scandal of her affair. Her name, once spoken with admiration, became a cautionary tale, a whispered reminder of the fragility of perfection. Her performances, once celebrated, were now remembered for the tragedy that followed. The scars left by the events of that fateful night ran deep, touching everyone in Riverdale in some way. But none bore the weight of the fallout more heavily than the Morgan children. They, more than anyone, were left to piece together a life shattered by choices they never made and a tragedy they could never escape. Years passed, but the echoes of the Morgan tragedy never truly faded from Riverdale. What had once been a picturesque town with a reputation for harmony and community was now forever marked by the events of that fateful night. The whispers continued in coffee shops, at Sunday brunches, and among the pews of other churches. The question lingered in everyone's mind, could it all have been prevented? For Richard Morgan, the weight of his actions remained a constant companion. After the trial, he disappeared from public life, retreating to a remote town far from Tennessee where no one knew his name. His once commanding demeanor was replaced by a quiet emptiness. He lived alone in a modest house, a stark contrast to the sprawling estate he had once called home. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and the monotony of his self-imposed exile offered little solace. Richard's only connection to his past came through letters and occasional visits from Emma and Liam, who were being raised by their grandparents. Now teenagers, they were learning to navigate a life shaped by the shadow of their family's downfall. Their letters were filled with updates about school, friends, and mundane activities, but an unspoken undercurrent of pain ran through every word. When they visited, their interactions with Richard were strained, the ghost of Sabrina's absence casting an unshakable pall over their attempts to reconnect. Richard tried to be the father they needed, but the guilt that consumed him made it nearly impossible. How could he guide them when he couldn't forgive himself? On sleepless nights, he often replayed the events in his mind, asking himself if there had been another way, any way, to have avoided the carnage that had torn his family apart. But the answers never came. He was left with only silence and the gnawing ache of regret. In Riverdale, Holy Grace Church stood abandoned, its doors locked and its pews collecting dust. Once a beacon of hope for the town, it now served as a grim reminder of the darkness that had unfolded within its community. Efforts to repurpose the building had failed, no one wanted to inhabit a space so laden with scandal and tragedy. Over time, the church became overgrown with vines, its facade cracked and weathered, mirroring the emotional scars left on the town. For Sabrina, her legacy as a celebrated ballerina was forever tarnished by the affair. The ballet company she had worked with quietly removed her name from their records, unwilling to associate their art with the scandal. Among the townspeople, Sabrina's story became a cautionary tale, a whispered warning about the dangers of infidelity and the fragility of appearances. Yet, for those who had truly known her, the story was more complicated. Sabrina wasn't just a woman who had made mistakes, she was a symbol of how the pressures of perfection could push someone to seek solace in the wrong places. As for Father Samuel McGregor, the revelations about his past cast a long shadow. Investigations into his previous misconduct were reopened, and his name became a black mark on the church's reputation. For many in Riverdale, the betrayal cut deep. Samuel had been a man they trusted, someone who had presided over their most sacred moments, baptisms, weddings, funerals. To learn that he had used his position to manipulate and exploit was a wound that the town struggled to heal. Despite the collective efforts to move forward, the tragedy of the Morgans lingered in Riverdale's consciousness. New scandals came and went, new families rose and fell, but the story of Richard, Sabrina, and Samuel was retold time and again, each version adding layers of speculation and myth. It became a part of the town's fabric, a dark chapter that no one could quite leave behind. In the quiet of his isolated life, Richard often thought of Sabrina. Despite everything, he still loved her in his own way. Her absence was a constant ache, a reminder of what they had shared and what they had lost. He thought of Samuel too, not with hatred, but with a bitter understanding of the man's flaws and the choices that had led them all to ruin. In moments of reflection, Richard wondered if any of them had truly been villains, or if they were simply victims of their own desires and mistakes. The Morgan tragedy was a tale of betrayal, passion, and consequences, but it was also a story of human frailty. Each of the players, Richard, Sabrina, Samuel, had made choices that seemed small in the moment but carried devastating repercussions. Their lives had collided in a way that no one could have foreseen, leaving behind a legacy that served as both a warning and a reminder of the complexities of love and loss. In the end, the town of Riverdale moved on, as towns always do. But the scars remained, etched into its history, whispered in its stories, and carried in the hearts of those who had lived through it. For the Morgan family, the wounds would never fully heal. And for Richard, every sunrise was a reminder of the darkness he could never escape.